Be now in our midst, O Lord. Open our hearts to what you have to teach us and what you have revealed to us. Amen. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Orthodoxy 101. This is going to be one of our last sessions, like I said. Starting in September, we're going to be doing something, but it's going to be different. All catechesis is going to take place after the liturgy following that point. But for now, we're here. Let's have fun. Does everyone who's here have a handout? Okay. We're going to be talking about orthodoxy and science. It's one of my most favorite topics, or one of the things I'm most interested in. So I've been waiting a long time to do this, and I haven't had an opportunity to yet. So hopefully we do the topic some justice by God's grace. And okay, let's begin, because like I said, there's a lot. Okay. So, yes. Yes. Pen. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I took that from you. Okay. So everyone in a developed country in the modern day has been aware of a tension between science, broadly defined, and religion, broadly defined. I put both of those terms, science and religion, in scare quotes. This distinction pops up in a million different forms and can manifest itself in almost every sphere of human life. From politics to medicine to education to morality, people talk about a distinction and many times a conflict between science, whatever they mean by that, and religion, whatever they mean by that. It's a very controversial subject because it tends to touch at people's deepest beliefs and values about the way the world works, what's true, what's not true, what's right, and what's wrong. Very many people have strong beliefs about science and strong beliefs about religion and strong beliefs about what role each should play in their own lives and in society. So, we're touching on, one of the thorniest subjects beyond related to the topic of faith, besides things like marriage and sexuality, which I plan to talk about next. So, stick around. But yes, science and religion are very significant. So let's get down to it. Is there actually a conflict between science and religion? Many people would tell you, yes, it is out there. And my answer is
no.
It depends.
It depends.
My answer is it depends. It really depends on what you mean by science and what you mean by religion. In order to have any kind of debate or discussion about a topic, you need to define what you're talking about. Otherwise, two people can talk right past each other. Religion, after all, is a notoriously slippery subject to define. In anthropology and in the study of human society and so on. For instance, is religion about gods and spirits? Well, some religions don't have gods and they don't have spirits either. Is religion about an afterlife? Some religions don't have an afterlife. Is it about rituals? Some religions don't have rituals. Some things have rituals, but we wouldn't call them religions. It's very difficult to say exactly what religion is. So if you're going to oppose it to something like science, you need to be able to say clearly what you're talking about. And secondly, religion, and this is, I think, is very important, but often misunderstood. Religion doesn't exist in the abstract. There's no such thing as religion. There are only individual religious traditions. Nobody believes in religion. People believe in Buddhism. They believe in Christianity. They believe in specific things, but there's no sort of generalized, vague notion of religion that encompasses all religious traditions. Christianity has specific concrete teachings. Buddhism has specific concrete teachings, and so on. But religion doesn't do anything. It's sort of a generalized, abstract subject. Furthermore, even within individual religious traditions, you can have radically different and even contradictory teachings and practices. So what the Sunni Muslims might teach you about a certain thing might be radically different from what the Shiite Muslims are going to tell you about that thing. The Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists, the Orthodox and the Protestant Christians, and so on and so forth. So again, when you just talk about religion in the abstract and how it relates to science, you're actually talking about way more than 100 different things. So it's a pretty useless discussion to have. But likewise, actually, science is famously hard to define. This is known as the demarcation the demarcation problem in the sort of philosophy and sociology of science. Is science a method? Is science a body of knowledge? Is science an authority? It's referred to all of the above at various times and by various people. Furthermore, what separates science from pseudoscience? It's harder to define than you think, especially with certain fields like parapsychology, which is the study of psychic phenomena, which many mainstream scientists would like to include from science, but in many ways it looks very much like a normal science, similar with what's so-called creation science, practiced by many sort of biblical fundamentalists here in the United States. These things can look a lot like science, but many scientists would like to say that they're not. So where do you draw the line, and on what basis do you draw the line? For instance, we're taught in school that science revolves around a method. A very simplified version of the scientific method is observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, / conclusion. So you start with an observation. All flamingos are pink. You create and all flamingos are pink and eat shrimp. You create a question. Are flamingos pink because they eat shrimp? Or you form a hypothesis that is, I'm sorry, I'm butchering it right now. Okay, so you observe that all flamingos are pink and eat shrimp. You develop a question. Are flamingos pink because they eat shrimp? You develop a hypothesis. Yes, indeed, flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp. You develop an experiment. I'm going to deprive a bunch of flamingos from shrimp for a while and see if they stop being pink. You have the data. Yes, I took away the shrimp from all these flamingos. Now they're no longer pink. Then I develop a conclusion based on the scientific process I just did. Therefore, flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp. It's a little bit of a silly, stupid example that I made up, but this is sort of like a broad outline of like what the scientific method is supposed to look like. That's what you learn in grade school. And this is a good definition as far as it goes. This is a good definition like for teaching grade schoolers about what science is. But it's a huge oversimplification, actually sometimes contradicted in the history of science. Famously, philosopher and historian of science Paul Feyerabend, in this book Against Method, which I think is fascinating. If you're into philosophy and you're into science, read Against Method. It's very good. Convincingly argues that Galileo actually started with his conclusion and worked backwards to make the evidence fit. Likewise, Louis, another one that I read in this Collins and Pinch, The Golem, very interesting book as well. Louis Pasteur ignored a bunch of experiments that he himself performed, which contradicted his hypothesis. You know, he's credited with the discovery of biogenesis, that life does not come from non-life, life only comes from other living things. But he actually we know from like his notes and his own recordings that we've discovered, you know, long after his death, that actually he had a number of experiments that seems to suggest that life could come from non-life. But he chose to ignore those, and he ended up being right. But science advanced despite the experiments and not because of them. So all I'm trying to say is the history of science is actually much messier than observation, hypothesis, conclusion, so on. It's very interesting, actually, if you dig into the history of science. So these were all important events that advanced the history of science, but they didn't follow the scientific method per se, or at least not in the way that it was taught to us in elementary school. Likewise, different scientific disciplines use significantly different methods. Paleontology, the study of ancient organisms in the rocks, is going to use very different methods from psychology, which is going to use very different methods from astrophysics. And these are all sciences, at least most people would consider all of these sciences, but they use very different methods. They're studied by very different types of people with very different scientific cultures, and there's not necessarily any inherent unity between a bunch of different sciences. So, you know, to be a paleontologist, you don't need to know any astrophysics per se. To be an environmental psychologist, what do you call it? Environmental, the ones who study the environment. The environmentalists, you don't need to necessarily know anything about psychology, for example. So we put all these things under the broad heading of science, but in the day-to-day practice, they don't necessarily have anything to do with one another. So again, when we're talking about science and religion, you can't just say there's this thing out there called science. There are sciences, there are scientists, there are particular facts or pieces of data, but there's really no such thing as science in the abstract, the same way there's no such thing as religion in the abstract. Likewise, if we treat science as facts about the natural world, that definition likewise creates problems because what is a scientific fact changes over time. So for example, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was something called, there was believed among physicists to be something called the luminiferous aether. So there was supposed to be a subtle material called ether, which was the medium through which light traveled. Physicists at the time believed that, you know, any sort of wave, and light was understood to be act as a wave, at least in many situations at that time. So they believed it had to be traveling through a medium. There must be this substance surrounding all of us called luminiferous aether. That was science. Luminiferous aether was science in the 18th and 19th centuries. It wasn't until right around the turn of the century that a famous experiment called the Michelson-Morley experiment really determined that there was no luminiferous aether. There was just vacuum in space. But what I'm saying is something that was a scientific fact, believed by scientists to be a reality for centuries, was later determined to not actually even exist. Likewise, the theory of plate tectonics, you know, now we all know from geology that the continental plates are moving around at very, very slow rates, but they're moving. And this is what, you know, creates the fault lines and the earthquakes in California and lava and this and that. However, it was first proposed in 1912 on the basis of empirical evidence, but was not actually accepted as a scientific fact in mainstream geology until the 1950s. So there we have something that we consider now to be true. Now we consider it to be scientific truth. However, for about 40 years, it wouldn't have been scientific truth. And if you went to talk about it in a geology classroom, they would say that's not actually the case. So science can change over time. I'm not saying science can just change at a whim. Okay, science is a really, sort of good means for establishing truths about the natural world. I'm just saying it's not absolute and it's not monolithic. So we can't just say science is this body of incontrovertible facts out there, because some things that are scientific facts understood today will not be a scientific fact tomorrow, and some things will be discovered and be a scientific fact tomorrow that are not a scientific fact today. So again, it just adds to sort of the slipperiness of defining these subjects. And likewise, sometimes science is also just treated as an authority. People all the time say, science says this, science says that. Famously, Anthony Fauci said, attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science. So you can have even situations where a person takes into themselves the full authority of science. And of course, science is something abstract. Science can't really speak for itself. Data and evidence can't speak for itself. Scientists can speak. It has to be science has to be interpreted and communicated by scientists. So science doesn't say anything. Science doesn't do anything. Scientists do things with scientific data. So that's all my very long way of saying. The first thing I want you to understand is that it's not really helpful to talk about science in general or religion in general. In order to meaningfully engage with the subject, you have to talk about specific domains of science, specific religious beliefs, and specific subjects related to the two. So if you want to talk about what is it? Is it the ideal gas law? PV equals nRT. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
PV-NERT? Yeah. Like, what does Orthodoxy have to say about PV-NERT? Pretty much nothing. What is what does Orthodoxy have to say about the law of gravitation? Pretty much nothing. There's a lot of subjects where they really aren't related, and we can't talk about a conflict between what the Holy Fathers say and what the ideal gas law says. Yes.
Whenever I hear science says or religion says, my first reaction to it is what they're talking about is the conflict between reason and revelation. And it may not turn out to be that as you listen to the conversation, but my instant reaction, oh, this is a debate about what is logical and what is believed on the premise of some other higher principle.
Right, and so that is a good way, I think, to narrow it in a lot of cases with the difference between reason and revelation. But I still think it's important to define, reason about what, which revelation. These things are still very, I believe in certain revelations. I believe in like the Bible and things revealed to the Holy Fathers. I don't believe in the Quran. So there are plenty of things you can call revelation that I do think accord with reason, or other things that are called revelation I don't think accord with reason. So it's well taken, and I think it's an important sort of narrowing of the subject. But even then, I think specificity is important. So anyway, there's no such thing as science in general or religion in general. In order to meaningfully engage, you need to be specific. So understood in this way, we can say that science and religion contradict each other. We can say that they harmonize with each other. We can say they have no relevance to each other, as with the ideal gas law and the Church Fathers. Depending on how you define them and what particular thing you're talking about, it's just not helpful to make generalizations like this. So please don't do it. Please never say that science says this or Orthodoxy says that. Please talk about specific things and then bring that into discussion. So this is all by way of introduction. We haven't even gotten to the topic yet. But it's just important to lay this groundwork because science and religion are very loaded topics, and very many people don't know much about either. So very many people, even intelligent, educated people, often don't have anything intelligent to say about science or religion. So that's why you need to really be clear when you're speaking. Okay, so with that very important How's it going? Maureen and Nasos, 22 minutes late. That's okay. You're still here. Just kidding. So just to fill you guys in, though, it was very important. We literally just finished the introduction, so that's all you missed. But the introduction was important, which is that basically there's no such thing as science in general, and there's no such thing as religion in general. There are only specific pieces of scientific data and knowledge said by specific scientists, and there are only specific religions or specific doctrines taught by religions. You can't speak about science in general. You can't speak about religion in general. So depending on how you define them, they can contradict each other, or they can align with each other quite well, or they could do neither. They could just be irrelevant to each other. So with that very important explanation out of the way, we can start talking about something concrete and specific, and which is the story of creation as taught and believed historically by the Orthodox Church, and natural history is defined by mainstream 21st century cosmology, geology, and biology. So that's where we're going. All of you have a handout, right? And those of you who are online, I'll pull it up. Okay. Can you guys see? Am I sharing my screen with you?
Yes, Father, we see it.
Okay, you see biblical account of creation? Okay. So right now we're just reading from Genesis 1:1. And this is as you know, or maybe as you don't know, you're here to learn. Genesis is the first book of the Bible, revealed, we believe, sometime around 1400 BC to Moses on Mount Sinai. It describes, Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It describes the creation of the world, among other ancient histories. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, so that evening and the morning were the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and so the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, so the evening and the morning were the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on earth, and to rule over the day and the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth and across the face of the firmament of the heavens." So God created sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed, and it shall be for food. Also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. So mind that last sentence. It has traditionally been interpreted to mean that in the original creation, there was no carnivory among animals. There were no meat-eating animals. Everything ate plants. And it was so. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Further, we're going to go down. We're going to read about the fall of man, but are there any questions so far? Yes?
Might be a little unrelated, but I guess I hadn't really noticed what he's saying in he says that he makes the heavens to be a sign. Is that almost like, because I think we mentioned last Orthodox 101 that over in history, like rulers have used the stars to like decide like the fall of nations and stuff.
Yeah, so there is so there's a couple things. I mean, the first is that God clearly, God's clearly stating that by creating the stars and the moon and so forth and the sun, and putting them in this sort of fixed rotation, that he is giving us like a calendar, something to mark our days by. At the same time, heavenly phenomena in the Bible have been associated with certain signs. So things that took place among the stars were I do think at certain points in the Old Testament, represented the rise and fall of rulers or things that were happening on earth, and most notably the one star guiding the wise men to the birth of Jesus. So there is this kind of sense that God allowed heavenly phenomena to communicate certain things. And I've heard this theory out there, this interesting idea that, at one point before the coming of Christ, God had actually given man the ability to read the stars and derive knowledge from them. But since then, that knowledge has been lost and won't return. I think it's an interesting thought. Or maybe he used it to communicate more directly in the past, but no longer does. Obviously, we certainly don't believe in astrology at this point, but who knows? Yes.
One thing that in the ancient world, it was very common to believe that the stars, the sun, and the moon were gods.
Yeah.
They're goddesses or whatever, children of the, you all probably know about Constantine the Great and going to the bridge and saying, legalizing Christianity. Well, before he did that, he was a firm believer of the God of the sun. And that what happened at the Melbourne Bridge changes from his perspective. But so this is one of the things that is important to remember here. God made these things. They didn't make us.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And that's actually behind the interpretation of some people say, notice that when it talks about the creation of the sun and the moon, it just says God created two great lights. And some people historically have interpreted that as refusing even to dignify them with names, so that they will be understood not to be gods. Because in other ancient cultures surrounding the ancient Israelites, they would have names because they would have identities because they were beings. And this Genesis is interpreted as saying, no, they don't have identities and they don't have independent existence. They were just created by God. That's a good point. So yes, so now the creation of the world, just in summary, over the course of 6 days, in general, so it appears to be over the course of 6 days by God's supernatural command that everything sprang into existence relatively instantaneously. But there's a process and an unfolding. It didn't happen all at once, and that's noteworthy as well. Okay, so now the creation and the fall of man, and the Lord God, and so this is Genesis chapter 2. I cut out a bunch of things just so we can get to the stuff that's most relevant, but there's a lot in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. I kind of wanted to read the whole things, but I just didn't. Okay, so and the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground the Lord God made every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you eat of it you shall surely die. So this has always been historically interpreted to mean that human beings would not necessarily have to die at all before the disobedience. So that human beings were made either immortal or in a quasi-immortal state, able to become immortal or mortal, depending on how they chose. That's the interpretation of the tree of life being there. That if they had followed the rules for a sufficient amount of time or in a sufficient way, then they would have gotten to eat from the tree of life and become immortal. But because they didn't. Anyway, so this is an important point, though, that in the traditional interpretation of Genesis, death did not exist before human beings chose to sin. Yes.
Can you clarify before we
Yeah.
Is the Orthodox? I've seen either a mix or one of either ways. What is the Orthodox stance that Genesis can either be symbolic or literal, or is there?
We're getting there. Yeah, that's what this class is. Is this symbolic? Is this literal? I'm telling you what the plain reading of the text says and how it has historically been interpreted. Because certainly before the 1850s, everyone pretty much took it at face value. Okay, so now we're getting further down. So now that was, the creation of man, and now we're going to get to the fall of man. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for, and so I'm leaving out the part where the serpent, tempted her and provoked her and so on. And I'm leaving out the creation of woman too, even though that's important. Just trying to get, the barest bones so that we can have enough time to do this class. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves covering. So the moment they chose to sin, their relationship with reality changed. Their eyes were open. They understood things in a new light. And now I'm skipping a bunch of stuff, and I'm getting to the curses. So after God, quote unquote, discovers their sin, tries to get them to confess, none of them confesses, but they accuse the other. God says, it wasn't me, it was the woman you gave me. So Adam says, it wasn't me, it was the woman you gave me. And then Eve says, it wasn't me, it was the serpent. And the serpent just, is the devil, and he gets cursed. But I'm skipping the curse of the serpent and everything. So now we're getting straight to the part where God curses Eve. To the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain, you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So specifically, the part about childbearing is worth noting because it suggests and has always been interpreted that reproduction would have been very different without the fall. The church fathers looked around, or all the ancient Christians and ancient Jews looked around and said, okay, childbirth as we know it is a very dangerous process and very messy process. In the modern day, thank God it's better, but certainly not smooth sailing. And they said, well, this can't be consistent with the very good creation God originally created. It must be that something changed. And what changed is believed to be the curse of God on mankind because of their sin. So it was believed in the original creation, human reproduction would have been very different, although no one speculates about what it looked like. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it. All the days of your life, both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In sweat of your face you shall eat your bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So again, another thing, the traditional interpretation is that mankind didn't have to work or struggle at all for food. It was just very easily accessible at all times, and it was only plants. And there was no need for agriculture or hunting or anything like that. But now, because of the fall of man, the sin of man, human beings have to struggle, have to toil in order to get food. Have worked very hard, especially for ancient people. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So that's God saying, okay, well now you're going to die, because you transgressed my commandments. You have become mortal now. Immortality is out of reach for you, at least at this juncture. And it's just funny because it kind of reinforces, at least some traditional Christian commentators I've seen have said, well, it says, dust you are because you were created out of the dust. It doesn't say, remember, man, that you are ape-like common ancestor, and to ape-like common ancestor you shall return. This sort of a silly point, but that has traditionally been seen as reinforcing the idea that man was created out of the dust of the ground. And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. So there's also talking about Adam and Eve, not as, at least again, in the traditional interpretation, not as metaphors, but as concrete historical persons. There was one physical mother from whom everyone came. And finally, this is just hold on to this last line because it will be important later. Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. The traditional Orthodox, and I note specifically Orthodox interpretation, was that this was actually, and this was actually an ancient Hebrew interpretation of this line as well. It's very interesting, but it's something you've never really heard of in the West, or at least I hadn't been educated, which is that this was them becoming corporeal, this them becoming material. Prior to this point, they were more spiritual, less physical, and God giving them tunics of skin is not interpreted as he gave them some clothes to wear, but rather this is him giving them bodies of flesh and bone, whereas previously they were more spiritual in their existence. This is a very interesting thing to note that will be relevant later. But for right now, I'm just letting you know. So this is, and now I'm just bringing us up right up from that point to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 21 to 2. So for since by man came death, this is Paul speaking, for since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all should be made alive. So I'm trying to emphasize the point that this is not just, one book of the Bible that spins things one way, but all the New Testament writers seem to reference the traditional understanding of Genesis, that there was no death before the fall. So it's not just like, okay, well, Genesis says that, but we can just kind of ignore it. Well, it does seem, this theme actually does seem to continue throughout the Bible too. So that's important. And then one more thing that we're going to talk about, just because we're from Genesis that we're going to breeze through, this is the flood. And why does the flood matter? If you don't already know, I'll explain it to you in a little bit. But the flood, Noah's flood, God said to Noah, build me an arky. Do you guys remember that?
Those animals.
Yeah. So you guys remember that. Okay,
Bible
well,
camp.
now the flood was on earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed greatly and increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. All flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle, and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, if the spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Again, so this is so Genesis seems to be talking very literally that this was an actual event in history where everything died and only Noah and his family survived. And again, it's referenced in other places of the Bible. So here in Matthew 24:37, we hear Jesus speaking. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be this coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will be the coming of the Son of Man. So Jesus is saying, his own coming will be like the days of Noah. But Jesus is speaking, he's talking about Noah as a real historical personage who existed, and the flood is a real event that happened in the past. And here's 2 Peter 3:5-7. Again, this is Peter speaking. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and on earth, and the earth standing out of the water, and in the water by which the world that existed then perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. So again, Peter talking about the world that then existed perishing by water. He's talking about the flood, again, as in a real historical event that's connected to the future event of Christ's coming again. So this is, these in short are the two, no, I just read the Genesis story. I'm also going to read a shortened version of the scientific story. Okay, and then we're going to compare and contrast the two. So this is the scientific story of origins. I took this from the Khan Academy website. I don't know what it is. I glean that it's like an educational thing. Is it for kids? It's very popular. Well, I was trying to find I wanted to find the scientific story of the history of the world as it's currently understood, and I wanted to find it in relatively brief form. And this was the only one I could find. So maybe the Khan Academy is good, maybe it's bad, but this was the only one that was like short and legible. So this is what is the name of this? Khan Academy, Khan. Yes, Dawn, you raised a hand.
Khan Academy. Dawn and I used it whenever we were homeschooling our kids. It was started by a man out of India who as the internet spread to different places in the third world, he wanted people without access to books to be able to access education. And so he just started it as a small series of lessons, and it just kind of grew, and lots of teachers from all around the world kind of added their knowledge to it and their curriculums. And lots of parents who homeschool use it to kind of support different homeschool programs that they use. It's very educational, and
Okay, so you vouch for it, basically?
oh yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Me too.
if you guys vouch for it,
He simplifies topics that are often complicated for some, and he finds a way to make it easy to communicate.
okay. Great. Well, good. That makes me more confident about my choice then. Yes, Benjamin.
I wanted to ask about the creation and fall of man.
Yeah, yeah.
What would so they, if they were corporeal or some degree of that before the fall, what kind of nakedness were they recognizing?
Yeah, that is a really good question, and very relevant. I think, if I remember correctly, that they were. I think there's something in Simeon the New Theologian who says that they were clothed in light before the fall, and that when they ate, all of a sudden, they had this special relationship with God. It's really hard to imagine, especially because it's incorporeal, and I don't understand it either, so I'm probably butchering the understanding. But something, Saint Simeon the New Theologian, I believe, said something about them being clothed with light, and then as they ate the fruit, they became more materially minded and sought a material covering or something. I don't really remember, but it's a good question. It has been addressed by the fathers, but I'm too stupid to have held on to it. So let's go. Scientific story of origins. So I'm going to give you a very brief, sketchy outline of the scientific story of origins from the Khan Academy. I'm going to comment a little bit on what I think sort of the scientific evidence, like everything that's taught in the scientific evidence, scientific origin story is based on some kind of scientific evidence, even if it's a really loose inference. Okay, in the beginning, as far as we know, there was nothing. Suddenly, from a single point, all the energy in the universe burst forth. Since that moment, 13.8 billion years ago, the universe has been expanding and cooling down as it gets bigger. So this is the Big Bang, if you've ever heard of it, and it's based on a couple of observations in astronomy and astrophysics, which is basically the first discovered in the 1920s that our universe is expanding. And so, if our universe is expanding, what does that mean? Well, if it's continually expanding, if you extrapolate backwards far enough, that must mean boom, boom, boom. You go back; it must have been at a single point. If it was continually expanding, and then there's another piece of evidence that was discovered either in the 50s or the 60s. I can't remember. But it's a type of radiation called the cosmic microwave background, which I'm going to butcher it if I try to explain it too much because I don't fully understand it. But I understand this is a really decisive piece of evidence in favor of the Big Bang, which seems to be some kind of picture, or at least it's taken to be some kind of picture of the forming of matter at the beginning of the universe. So once the cosmic microwave background was discovered, apparently most cosmologists jumped on board to believe that the Big Bang was true. That was in the 50s or 60s, and I believe they got a Nobel Prize for it. Yeah.
I think the key thing with it is that it's like relatively uniform, randomly distributed everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like why it's like I guess evidence.
Okay.
So
I trust you. I don't
That's
fully.
it.
I
As
don't.
in, like anywhere you look in the sky, it kind of looks the same.
Yeah. Well, good. So energy. So we're still talking about what's referred to as the Big Bang. Gradually, energy cooled enough to become matter. One electron could stay in orbit around one proton to become an atom of hydrogen. Great clouds of hydrogen swirled around space until gravity pulled some atoms so close together that they began to burn as stars. Stars swirled together in giant clusters called galaxies. Now there are galaxies numbering in the billions. That's true. There's so many galaxies out there. After each star burned up all its matter, it died in a huge explosion. The explosion generated so much heat that some atoms fused together and got more complex, forming many different elements, including gold and silver. One giant star, our mother star, exploded and scattered clouds of gas containing all the elements needed to form living beings. At about 5 billion years ago, gravity pulled these atoms into a new star, our sun. Leftover pieces of matter stuck to each other and formed 8 planets, which revolve around the sun. The third planet out, Earth, became our home. It was the perfect size, not too big, not too small, the perfect distance from our sun, not too far, not too close. A thin crust formed over Earth's hot interior, and the temperature was just right for water to form on parts of the surface. Gradually, the chemicals in water formed inside of membranes and got more complex until one-celled living organisms appeared, able to maintain themselves and reproduce. So this is what we're talking about right now is called abiogenesis, and it's the theory that the first life on Earth emerged out of sort of chemicals coming together in such a way that they could reproduce. People are shaky on what the details are because it's never been done in a laboratory. And as I said in a previous lecture, there's no actual proof of concept. We've never actually demonstrated that abiogenesis could happen. But it's believed because when you go down deep enough into the rock layers of the Earth, you get to a point where they're just single-celled. There's just evidence of single-celled microorganisms having been there, and before that, nothing, no life. So the inference made is that at some point you had no life, and then you had single-celled organisms. It must have been some kind of process of increasing complexity among the organic molecules. Yes.
If that's true, then it could not be reproduced by us because we need a couple of million years to pull it off.
So,
and we can't function in that way.
So suffice it to say that's the thought around a lot of subjects related to evolution. The problem with that is that because people have posited that idea before, the problem with that is these organic molecules don't hold together very long when they're outside of a cell membrane. So there's sort of this paradox where it seems to have maybe taken a long time, but at the same time it also seems like a long period of time would have hurt, actually not helped. The development of life in that way. Suffice it to say that from the modern scientific perspective, it's a mystery how, if it did happen, how it should have happened. So it's one of the weaker links in the evolutionary story. For 3 billion years, these one-celled creatures were produced almost exactly, but not quite. They gradually changed in response to their environment. Actually, according to the Darwinian story, they changed. They changed just randomly, and then the environment weeded out some of them and left others. But the evidence for this is that when you go down deep in the rock layers, you have what appear to be big stacks of just single-celled organisms for a long time with no complex organisms. But they also changed their environment. They learned to burn energy from the sun, and they released oxygen to the atmosphere. The oxygen formed an ozone layer around Earth that protected life from the sun's rays. Eventually, cells stuck together to form creatures with many cells. Plants and animals came out of the sea and onto land and became ever more complex and aware. Until about 100,000 years ago, human beings evolved from a shared ancestor with a species of apes. So again, as you go down deep in the rock layers, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but first you have what appears to be single-celled organisms, and then as you go up in the rock layers, you start to see more complex organisms. Then you see really complex organisms, mostly shallow marine organisms like things called trilobites, and then only after that, above that, you see like land organisms. So that's the idea of, I don't know if you've seen like the opening theme of Dilbert or something where you have the animals crawling out of the water onto land. That's the idea, because the first organisms you find deep in these rock layers are single cell, multi-cell. So that's where sort of the idea comes from. It comes from the fossils we observe under the Earth. And then, of course, you also have this phenomenon, way higher up in the rock record where you have things that look like apes, followed by things that look a little more like humans than apes, and then humans that look a little more like apes, and then fully modern humans. So you do find these patterns when you go down into the rock record. So humans could talk in symbols and sing and dance, draw, and cooperate with more than other animals could. Of course, a lot of this is speculative. We can only just infer. We can't actually go back in time and look at these things. But this is the inference made. Humans learned to write and to accumulate their learning so that it kept expanding. Humans increased in skills and in numbers until there were too many people and too few big animals to hunt in some places. Then humans learned to grow their own food and herd their own animals. Some animals learned to cooperate with humans. This gave humans a new source of food and work energy, and they could live in larger and larger groups. These groups expanded into cities and empires, using more and more of the resources of the earth. Humans collaborated and learned collectively in more complex ways. They traveled, traded, and exchanged inventions, creating vast civilizations of astonishing beauty and complexity. So, Cynthia Stokes Brown. Okay, but retrieved from the Khan Academy. Okay, so we just read the traditional understanding of Genesis, and now we just read the modern scientific origin story. Like I said, the traditional Genesis was, we believe it was revealed by God to Moses on top of Mount Sinai, roughly 1,400 years before Christ, so 3,500-ish years old. give or take. And the scientific story, which has been developed over time, especially over the last 100 to 200 years, based on various pieces of data we've discovered in looking at the Earth. Okay, so points of harmony. Where do they go? Where do they go together? Well, like we said, science and religion can conflict. They can harmonize. They can do a lot of different things depending on what we're specifically talking about. Points of harmony. Both have a beginning, and this is a bigger point than some might realize, given that both philosophers of the ancient past and some geologists of the more recent past have believed in more of an eternal universe, that things sort of already existed as far as we know, and they always were the way they are, and they always will be the way they are. Before the Big Bang was accepted in the 50s and 60s, or 60s, whichever one it was, I can't remember, most cosmologists, people who study the stars, believed that the universe was eternal, that it just always existed. So the idea that the Earth has a beginning is not something we should take for granted, and the fact that both of these stories of origins have the Earth beginning at a point in time and progressing in a linear way is interesting, because there are alternatives, either that everything's been eternal or that there are cycles. But the idea of a beginning and a linear progression is biblical, and it's also part of the scientific story. Both have a progressing unfolding of the development of the universe with a loose correspondence in terms of order. So the Bible, just like the scientific origin story, have things unfolding over time. It's not that mankind immediately shows up on the scene, but it's first there's even a loose correspondence between the two in terms of order. So in both, you have the material creation precedes biological life. You have the creation of the earth before the creation of plants, before the creation of human beings. You also have life coming from the oceans first, actually. In the Genesis story, creatures from the oceans come first, and land animals come on the next day, and man comes last. And also in both stories, you have man as the sort of crown of creation. Man comes on the scene last and takes everything over. You have that in both Genesis and in the scientific origin story. You also have some other interesting points of harmony. So you have some latitude for the natural development of plant and animal life. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, God says, "Let the water teem." It kind of sounds like God is, and in fact, it's been interpreted by traditional commentators as this is God endowing nature with a certain creative power. God says, "Let the land produce all the animal life and all the seeds bearing their kind." So there is this interesting idea where the two align, with God allowing the earth a certain ability to create and influence the development of things on its own. Ancient Christian commentators such as St. Basil interpreted this to mean that God endowed nature with its own creative powers, derivative yet distinct from God's supernatural intervention. And so I think it's important to note these points of harmony between Genesis and the scientific origin story, because even in this narrowly defined subject, so like I said, science and religion don't exist in general. You only have specific things. But even in this specific, more narrow area, you have places of harmony and places of conflict. It's not one or the other. They go together in some ways, and they deviate in other ways. I'm especially interested in the fact that it's precisely the big picture items where Genesis aligns with the scientific origin story. So it's not that the two stories align in small scattered details, but it's the overall vision of sort of the process and unfolding of creation seems to be at least somewhat in harmony. That's very interesting, in the linear nature of time and history, as opposed to being cyclical or eternal. Yes?
Isn't there a contrast? In Genesis 1, you have this man is woman come at the end of the sixth day, and then in the next chapter, God creates man and woman from the dust of the ground, and well, they need companions. And so then God makes creatures, and he brings the creatures to the person, Adam, and Adam names them.
So yeah, not quite. So I believe in Genesis 2, what you're talking about, I think there are some discrepancies with Genesis 1, but what happens is God does create animals before man. He creates man, specifically a male, Adam, and then he says, "I need to create a helper for Adam." And so God brings all the animals which he already created to Adam, Adam sees that there's no helper for
No,
himself.
there's nothing that really works.
But so he needs a helper who is like himself. He's the
Yes.
same sort of thing he is, and that's where
Bone of
get
my
woman.
bone, flesh of my
Yes.
flesh.
So yes, there is somewhat of a discrepancy, I think, between Genesis 1 and 2. But overall, I think they're always taken as to be two tellings of the same story, the one in just greater detail. So now we moved from the points of harmony between Genesis and the scientific origin story. Let's talk about where there's disharmony. I'm going to start with the more minor points. So despite some encouraging points of contact between the traditional creation story and the scientific origin story, there are significant points of disagreement which cannot be ignored. So I hate when people say they see no problem harmonizing Genesis and the scientific origin story. Yes, there are very interesting ways in which they harmonize, but they also have non-trivial points of disagreement, and they must be taken seriously if they're intellectually honest. And the reason I say that is just because I remember a couple times reading around on the subject, which was, very of interest to me, and I'd come across like an Orthodox priest who would just say, well, I have no problem reconciling Genesis and the science, and then would give no details or no explanation. It just strikes me as you're not taking the subject seriously, because when you actually engage with and investigate this stuff, you do run into some problems. It's not embarrassing to admit. It's just the reality. So let's start, first of all, with the smaller points of disagreement, what I would consider to be the smaller points of disagreement. Genesis has creation take place over 6 24-hour days. The scientific origin story has billions of years. And of course, if you add up all of the other genealogies in Genesis and elsewhere, you get about, depending on which version of the Old Testament you're reading, you get that the creation happened sometime 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So again, still very different from billions of years. Likewise, Genesis has Earth being created before the rest of the universe, including the sun and the moon. The scientific origin story has many, many billions of galaxies being created before Earth. It's funny that it's just on day 4. It says God created the stars also, and that's all you really have of the story of the creation of all these untold billions of galaxies. Genesis has plants before the sun. The scientific origin story says, of course, sun is needed for plants to arrive. Genesis has birds before land animals, but the scientific origin story has land animals before birds, and sea animals before land animals, and so on. Genesis has animals created according to their kind, which may imply limits on evolution. That's a little more nebulous, but it does seem to suggest the scientific origin story has everything coming from one common ancestor. And Genesis does seem like it sounds like God created things according to kind. So these first points are real disagreement. These things I just talked about. They do contradict each other, but they seem more like disagreement about how things happened rather than disagreement about the nature of reality. I personally, all of these points I just mentioned, like this, is it 6 days over 6,000 years, or is it like billions of years? I don't really lose sleep over that, or I wouldn't really lose sleep over that particular point. I can just say, okay, well, maybe our interpretation of Genesis needs to be a little looser. So I could accept all of these being harmonized by a looser reading of the text of Genesis. Yes.
It seems like no one really acknowledges the fact that God is timeless. So he creates something before we have our own conception of time with our minds. Theoretically, 24-hour day could be a million years to God, because it's
right.
He's indifferent to time until we come into play, right?
Right. And there's also some fun things you can play with, like with Einstein's theory of general relativity. I mean, I remember reading about one creationist scientist who developed a model of the universe where the Earth is created only in 6 days, but because the way things line up, the 13 billion years pass in the rest of the universe. So time is a funny thing. Time in and of itself is not the issue, and it's something we can play with. So I agree that in and of itself are more minor disagreements, I would say. Jordan, question: does Orthodoxy view 2 Peter 3:8? But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day, is relevant to the 6-day creation period. Yes, it is relevant. To that, and I think Saint Basil the Great himself says, like, who really knows? Genesis was in 6 days, but who really knows what a day meant for God at that point in time for human beings? So I think that's correct. However, that's not the big issue here. We're going to get to the big issues. We're going to get to the points of major disharmony. So that was just peanuts, what we just deal with. As you can probably intuit, on top of these smaller points of disagreement, there are at least two, from my perspective, two serious conflicts between the scientific origin story and Genesis. Genesis has always been interpreted by both the New Testament and the Church Fathers as saying that death and natural evil, so carnivory, disease, suffering, did not exist before the human beings first sinned. According to the scientific origin story, death and natural evil and earthquakes and viruses and all the bad stuff have been part of the world from the very beginning. So this is, I would say, a bigger conflict. This is a bigger issue. This is not a disagreement about the details of how things happened or lengths of time. This is more of a disagreement that cuts to the nature of reality and the nature of human beings and our experience of the world. So that is, I think, the biggest conflict. And the Church Fathers and recent Orthodox saints and elders are also pretty unanimous that there was no death, no disease, no suffering before mankind came. People who don't believe that do agonize it. You know, it's called theodicy. You know, the justification of God. How could God create a world with so much suffering? You know, with cancer and small children. The traditional Orthodox answer was always, well, he didn't. We made it that way by introducing sin. But so these do appear to be two conflicting visions of reality, and that's why I said it's a major point of disharmony, not minor. The point about the flood is somewhat different. And so number one is the origin of death and evil. That is a conflict. And it's a conflict we can't ignore and pretend it's not there. Number two, the point about the flood is somewhat different, but it's very relevant. And this is, we're going to have to, I've brought an illustration for you guys that we're going to talk about in a minute. And I'll share it with you guys on your screen. So this is an image of what's called the geologic column. We'll talk about it. So the point about the flood is somewhat different. So the evidence for the long age of the Earth and for evolution, or that's taken to be for the long age of the Earth and evolution, comes to what is referred to as the geologic column. So starting in the 1700s or so, geologists, people who study the Earth, discovered that as one digs between underneath the ground anywhere on Earth, one encounters distinct layers, which are made up of different types of rock, and which have fossilized within them different types of creatures, often extinct. This pattern of different, distinct layers of Earth, traceable all around the world, came to be referred to as the geologic column. So if you understand that, you know, the Earth beneath us was built up over periods of time, whether they were short periods of time or long periods of time, what's down there happened before what's happening now. And what happens in each layer beneath each other layer must have happened before the layer that came after it, right? I mean, it's logic. It's called the principle of superposition. So as the further down you go, you must be looking at earlier and earlier things. That's pretty straightforward. Originally, and so you can see in the picture of the geologic column, this is like an extreme simplification. But if you look up towards the top at the Pleistocene, you know, you see like a woolly mammoth skull. And you go all the way down to the Jurassic, you see a Tyrannosaurus skull. You go all the way down to the Ordovician and the Cambrian, you see trilobites. And the point of that is the life, it's not just that the rocks you find at different levels of the geologic column are different from one another, but the actual creatures you see in the different levels of the geologic column are different from one another. So originally, the geologic column was interpreted as the result of various catastrophes in Earth's past, things like floods burying whole environments rapidly. But by the 1800s, the mainstream scientific consensus developed that these layers of Earth were laid down in a slow buildup over the course of millions of years. This perspective is called uniformitarianism. So originally, it was seen, it was believed that these were just, you know, the results of various floods that happened on the Earth or something that caused all these life forms to be buried. But rightly or wrongly, by the mid-1800s, the idea was that we're actually looking at millions of years. We're looking at long periods of time that built up very slowly. This interpretation of Earth's history, by the way, does seem to be strongly supported by a scientific technique known as radiometric dating. So again, more background. Radioactive elements decay at known rates. So given what we know about uranium-238, we know that if we have a certain amount of uranium-238, which decays over time, it's unstable, it decays to lead. A certain amount of uranium-238, if we have a certain amount, we know that half of it will be gone over the course of 4.5 billion years. That's called the half-life. And we understand based on observations that it decays at a consistent rate. Given these rates of decay, which are consistent as far as we can observe them, as we go into the layers of the Earth, we can compare the ratios of parent isotopes to daughter isotopes. So if I can go down into the Cambrian layers of the Earth. I can measure how much uranium is in there, compare the amount of uranium that's in there to the amount of lead that's in there, and determine how much time, in addition to other pieces of evidence, I can determine, from a secular perspective, how much time must have passed. So I determine that the Cambrian is 500 million years old, and that as I go up in the column, I find that, based on these methods of dating, the Cretaceous was only 145 million years old. So that's radiometric dating, and it was discovered after uniformitarianism became dominant. So radiometric dating did seem to confirm what was already the dominant position of geology. So it would appear to be a strong evidence in favor of old Earth, and this is the primary reason why all mainstream geologists believe that the Earth is billions of years old. So whenever you hear someone say the Earth is 4.5 billions of years old, how do they know that? Well, they're talking about the ratios of different isotopes to one another deep within the core of the Earth. That's where they get that number from. This became mainstream. I mean, radiometric dating itself wasn't worked out until like the 40s or the 50s of this last century. But the idea that the layers of the Earth were millions of years old was determined by the mid-1800s, and that's when Darwin came up with his theory. So the fact that we consistently find different creatures at different layers of the geologic column is the exhibit A of evolution. We see different life forms at different periods of Earth history, therefore the life forms themselves must have changed over time. At least that's the inference that scientists made, and it was actually Darwin's first training was as a geologist, and that's why he looked at the Earth, he looked at these layers, and then he also observed a lot of animals in real life, and then he came to his idea. So if one takes the geologic column as evidence for an old Earth and evolution, there's no room in Earth history for a global flood of Noah's day. Conversely, if you choose to interpret the geologic column as the record of Noah's flood, all the evidence for evolution disappears. Thus, there's a massive conflict in these two views of Earth history. So, the modern young Earth creationists would say that all of this right here, from Cambrian up through maybe the Pleistocene or something, that's actually, it wasn't millions of years, it was just one flood came and it swallowed the shallow reef organisms, and then it came onto the land, and then it swallowed these other environments. So these are two irreconcilable visions of Earth history. You can't take it as both evidence of evolution and evidence of a flood. Either it's evidence of one flood that happened in a short period of time, or it's evidence of millions of years. That's why I'm saying this is a different point of conflict between Genesis and the scientific origin story that is often overlooked, but I think it's important. If you believe in a historical global flood, all of your evidence for evolution kind of disappears. But again, you still have the radiometric dates to deal with. So thus, the traditional Orthodox Christian account of Earth history and the modern scientific origin story conflict in two major ways, specifically regarding what? The origin of death and disease and natural evil, and two, in the occurrence or non-occurrence of a major worldwide flood in Earth history. Now, we finally gotten to the meat of today's class. So it's been an hour and 10 minutes, and now we can talk about now we can start talking about this. Okay, can these large discrepancies be reconciled? If so, how? But first, let me say before we actually get to it, let me say one quick note about evolution. The word evolution is a slippery word, just like science, just like religion. It can use a lot of things. It have a lot of meanings in the modern day. We use it very loosely in our modern society, often with multiple contradictory meanings. In terms of the grand scientific origin story that we read, the word evolution generally refers to two related but distinct things. The first is universal. The first thing that evolution can mean is universal common ancestry. That's the idea that all currently living organisms are descended from one or several original single-celled organisms through some process of change over time. So the first meaning of evolution is just the idea that things developed over time from one small single-celled organism and diversified in all these creatures. The second is the second meaning of evolution can specifically refer to the mechanism by which that process happened, which is called the neo-Darwinian synthesis, at least as it's referred to in mainstream scientific circles, which is a theory about how that process of change took place, with random mutations in organisms being naturally selected over time by environmental circumstances, leading to change in organisms over time. So Darwin realized that every time an animal reproduces, it produces a whole bunch of different smaller animals, and each of those smaller animals is somewhat different than the last. When a dog has a bunch of puppies, they're all somewhat different from one another. His theory was that if you could repeat that process, over millions of years, then eventually the only ones are going to be left are the ones who had really beneficial changes, and those changes, because all of them are changing, are going to stick in a population and continue to develop over time. That's the theory of natural selection acting on random variation. And Darwin said it could explain everything we see. He looked around and said all of life can be derived from those two principles: natural selection and random variation, and overproduction, which is just the fact that animals have a lot of babies and not just one. Okay, so anyway, this is an important distinction, these two senses of evolution. One is just the idea that everything developed over time, and two is specifically the way they developed over time, natural selection. So evolution, these meanings are related, universal common ancestry, but this is an important distinction because universal common ancestry contradicts the traditional biblical story, but does not necessarily get rid of the need for God as the originator or guide of evolutionary change. So you can have universal common ancestry without necessarily getting rid of God, but Darwinism, at least according to Darwin, does claim to make God's supernatural intervention irrelevant to the evolutionary process. So Darwin's whole idea was that you just don't need God. With these few natural principles, you can explain how everything got here. God just had no part of it. It's not. So Darwin didn't at least believe in the traditional biblical God. I think he believed in like something, but it does make God supernatural. Or if it's all correct, it makes God's supernatural intervention seem irrelevant. At least it doesn't seem necessary, the development of things. So the evidence for universal common ancestry comes primarily from the fossil record. Like I said, we dig way down, we see single-celled organisms. We see a little higher, there seems to be more complexity. We dig higher, we have sea animals and land animals, so on. That is the evidence that's taken to be universal common ancestry. The evidence for Darwinian processes comes from modern day observations. It's definitely true, given those facts I just said, that some amount of natural selection acting on random variation accounts for some of the things we see in the natural world. So you guys remember biology class, like peppered moths or this or that, or bacteria in a soap dish or whatever. You do have situations where Darwinian processes act and change the traits in a population. The idea that Darwinian processes explain all of biological life is, from my perspective at least, much more of an open question, even though it's zealously defended by Richard Dawkins, the famous evolutionary biologist who's a zealous atheist, who says natural selection on variation is all you need to explain the entire universe, and there's not a single mystery. We've got it all figured out. I think that's extreme. I think it's definitely true that Darwinian processes are real, they act, but can they explain everything? But anyway, that's just my own conjecture. Even some people who believe in God think that. So when we talk about evolution, we can mean two things: the story of all life descending from one common ancestor, from microbes to microbiologists, or we could mean the mechanism which explains the story, natural selection acting on random variation. Proponents of the scientific origin story often treat the two as a package deal, but they're not necessarily the same, and that'll be relevant. Did you have your hand raised?
Yeah. The thing that troubles me in that second aspect was progresses to what?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, if you want to use the brain, yeah, human beings come out pretty much at the apex of that cycle of that development. But if you want to use eyesight, birds in the air are much sharper than you are at eyesight. My dog smells much better than I do. Is she higher up?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to create this chain, it has to work for everything, and
so like some of these hardcore Darwinist types would say exactly what you're saying, which is that the only reason we see it as a progression is because we are privileging ourselves and putting ourselves at the top. Yeah. But if there's really a universe where nothing matters, then the brain is no more significant than the sense of smell or the eyesight. In which case, evolution has no progress; it just moves in all different directions. That's what they would say. It's not what I'm saying, but
which makes it meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's what their idea is, that evolution is meaningless. Yes.
Does anyone know if they have an explanation for? I mean, it's a very simple question. What was before the Big Bang? What caused nothing, or all of this matter to appear? Yeah.
So there are theories about that, and they're all speculative, because my understanding is that once we can use our equations about physics to get back really close to the Big Bang, but once we get really close to the Big Bang, if I'm understanding correctly, a physicist can contradict me, is that once we get too close to the Big Bang, our equations no longer apply. They no longer make sense. You know, things get too hot and too dense for all of our logic. So we just get to this point where we have to throw our hands up. There are theories that it's a quantum microwave fluctuation, whatever. But they're all speculative, is my understanding. Dawn.
Yeah, there's been recent experimentation with computer modeling about the age of the universe, because one thing they've noticed in the last few years is not only is everything moving away from each other, it's accelerating as it does so.
Mm-hmm.
So they've actually made some adjustments to the computer modeling, and just in the last 3 or 4 months, they've kind of come to a consensus that instead of the universe being 13.8 billion years old, they now believe it's about 25 to 27 billion years old.
I have heard something like that.
18 billion.
And that, yeah. Just what's a billion between friends? And that you know that it's a very interesting comment on the nature of what is a scientific fact. You know, it was recently dark energy, which is what's supposed to be accelerating this process of change, was not discovered, I think, until the 90s. And again, in a sense, it hasn't been discovered because we never observed it. We just infer its existence. So things can change, and who knows? But that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Dawn, you want to say something again?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when I was considering pre-med, when I was still in high school, I thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this, because I was having such a hard time understanding some concepts of physics and things like that. So I went to like my counselor, and they put me in touch with people, and I found out that, like, from a really smart professor, that no, you're not having a hard time. None of us know. We don't understand that. We don't know. We have theories, we have ideas, but we don't really know. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's why that never made sense, because we don't, there's so much. I wish that science in school would be taught more as theories. We think this might be, instead, like, I was taught so many things that were facts that now at 53, we're certain that those things that I was taught as a child are not scientific facts.
Right.
You know? So,
right. And that is relevant. If the explanations they bottom out after a certain point. So thank you for sharing that. Yes, John.
I was going to say that if I take from both a scientific and religious perspective, that the only thing I know is that I know nothing.
Right. And that's very important, honestly, for perspective. I find that the people, the biggest times, people see as a real strong conflict with between science and religion is when people take science as this absolute monolithic revealed truth. I remember I got in a very frustrating conversation with someone a few months ago, because that's how he treated science. Of course, he was not a scientist himself, because so the romance increases with distance. The further you're removed from the process, the more idealized to a picture you can have of it. But my experience with actual science, practicing science, I said my dad is a very accomplished scientist, and so I grew up with him and around other scientists my whole life. There's a fly on me. I don't know what that means. And my experience, at least in private, is that scientists are like quite open-minded, and they're quite willing to admit. I think sometimes in public they change their demeanor somewhat, but like actual real working scientists do seem to be rather quite open-minded. Anyway, okay, so it's important to confess our ignorance. Like I said, we're going to still be going. We probably still have at least another 15 minutes if anyone needs to go. Usually the class doesn't go this long. At least I try not to let it. But I'm having fun. Okay, so we've talked about evolution, we've talked about the scientific origin story, we've talked about Genesis. Now we're going to talk about reconciliation schemes. How do people make sense of these two things? How does a Christian living in the modern world, what are we to do? So far we've discussed the traditional Orthodox Christian stories derived from Genesis and the modern scientific origin story. And we said that while they have some interesting points of harmony, they have some serious points of disagreement, namely the origin of death and the flood. These are the big problems. This is well known. People have not been ignorant of this apparent conflict, and many intelligent modern Christians have tried to come up with a number of ways to reconcile their belief in the truth of the Bible and God's revelation with the data of contemporary geology, biology, and cosmology. So the issues are coming from those spheres. And no matter what approach one takes, something's got to give. We need to change the way we interpret Genesis, the scientific origin story, or both. We can't say that everything can stay the same. We can't say that everything's hunky-dory. We should, now, at the same time, we should not be shocked or upset that there are contradictions between various spheres of science and the traditional interpretation of our faith. There are contradictions and paradoxes in almost any given field of serious inquiry. Why? Because we're limited in our knowledge. We're not omniscient. We don't have all the facts. And so famously, quantum mechanics and general relativity in physics, they don't line up with each other. They're not, in our current state of knowledge, reconcilable with one another. You know, some physicists hope to find a theory of everything one day. But as it stands, we have these two very important, well-established, you know, perspectives in physics that don't seem to match up yet. Both seem to be true at the same time. In philosophy of mind, you know, the idea, well, what is the mind? What is consciousness? Is it material? Is it immaterial? Both of those perspectives have problems. Is it neither material nor immaterial? Well, that perspective has problems. So in any serious field of inquiry, we just run into problems. So to say, okay, yes, there are problems with Genesis and science, okay, but there are problems everywhere. You're going to have to bite the bullet somewhere. You're everywhere in your life. Yes.
I was dying to bring that up because the hard problem with consciousness is a huge thing now. No one can answer how neurons in our brains produce consciousness at all.
Right,
so that
right.
almost destroys every concept we have of what reality even is.
Right, because all of our experience starts with minds. You know, we only experience reality through our minds, but what are our minds? And no one can really say. And so just don't be intimidated by the fact. I think either we try to pretend that everything's okay. Oh yeah, there's no issues. You know, science, religion, it's all, you know, hold hands, kumbaya. Or other people just try to get rid of one. Just say, okay, religion's all stupid because it contradicts science. Or science. Some people, you know, say science is all stupid because it contradicts my faith. And the reality is, I think just to be an intelligent person, to have serious knowledge of things, you just have to be comfortable with some tensions, some apparent contradictions. That's just how it is. Did someone want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the scientific perspective, I can't really evaluate that,
right,
because that's not my background.
Yeah.
And I don't know that much about it. But I spend a lot more time in history.
Yeah.
And when I read these stories in Genesis, I read them not from the perspective of how do they gel with 21st century views of science. I read them, how do they gel with other views of the creation of the world at the time these documents were written. So there you have to go back and you have to read documents from the ancient Near East, Babylonian creation stories, and biblical creation stories, and compare and contrast them. And when you do that, you have a very different perspective.
Yeah.
And
so I think that's pretty popular in like ancient Near East studies right now, is to view Genesis in compare and contrast with like Epic of Gilgamesh or Enuma Elish or whatever the heck it's called.
Yeah.
Yes.
They had found that a lot of seemingly unrelated cultures had flood stories from their history.
So that is true, and that is important. And you can actually find collections of that anywhere. I have one on my shelf. A lot of cultures, like I had heard people say that a lot, but I didn't know the extent of it until I picked up a book on the subject. So yeah, you know, the ancient Greeks have a story about what one time in the ancient past when a flood covered the world. Ancient Indian Vedic culture has the same thing. Ancient Chinese culture, similar thing. All across North and South America, you have the same thing. That a flood happened in the past. And so like a lot of times both Orthodox or Catholic missionaries or Protestant missionaries would roll up to some island or some, you know, native tribe and start talking about, you know, okay, well, this is what happened in the world. And the native people, like in Alaska, when St. Herman went to them, they were like, oh yeah, we know about the flood. Yeah, it was da 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 da. Or like the you know, some Mayan people, I'm going to understand the same thing. North America, South America. So it is like kind of remarkable, right, that this has popped up again and again. And so people come up with natural statistic theories like, oh, floods happen everywhere, so on and so forth. But it's a really interesting piece of data, in my opinion. Dawn.
Yeah, the Graham Hancock has very, very compelling data to actually support a worldwide flood, not just based on these stories, but based on actual scientific evidence that's been recovered all over the earth. Basically has a theory called the upper dryas impact theory. That at the like at the end of the last ice age, about sometime between 11,800 and 12,600 years ago, some sort, whether it was an asteroid or a comet, hit the Canadian ice sheet. And because it didn't actually strike the Earth, but it struck this ice sheet, that's why we don't have a giant impact crater to show it. But something of sufficient size striking that ice sheet would hit it with enough force and enough heat that it would basically just flash fry just a huge section of that glacier that covered most of Canada and North America. And so basically, it would just create enough water and throw enough water into the atmosphere that it would, say, rain for 40 days and 40 nights everywhere. And the scientific data that he actually shows to support it is in the geological record, there are microcarbon spheroids, tiny diamonds that they happen at areas of impact. And it's noticed that sometime in between 11,800 and 12,600 years ago, no matter where you dig on the Earth, you will find these tiny, just molecule-sized diamonds that basically support the idea that something happened that threw enough of these into the atmosphere that it doesn't matter whether you're digging in Indonesia, in China, in North America, in Africa, in Europe, but you dig down to about this level where it's between 11,800 and 12,600 years ago, and there are these microspheroid diamonons.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating. I don't know Graham Hancock, so I can't evaluate. I know of him. I've never like listened to or read his stuff.
He was considered like such, just like a quack, but so much of what he said 30 years ago now is standard, what standard scientists are saying. We both have read all his stuff because we find it fascinating. But
that book is called Fingerprints of the Gods.
Okay, I'll look into it because that is very interesting stuff, and I think relevant for what we're talking about. I'm going to get into. Just keep going because we still have stuff to cover, and I feel bad about keeping you guys, even though this is a really interesting conversation. Okay, so we're talking about reconciliation schemes. How do we reconcile what is traditionally believed about the origin of death and the flood? So we shouldn't be shocked or upset about the contradictions between these pieces of scientific evidence and our faith, because we're always going to run into contradicting things. I think in St. Basil's time, actually, if I remember correctly, he needed to work hard to say that there was a beginning to anything, because as far as you look in the ancient world, the sun's always been there, the earth has always been there, they're not going anywhere. Why do you need to say it was all created necessarily? And now we're in a different position where the mainstream consensus is that there was a beginning, but it was just a different sort of beginning. So because our knowledge is limited, we shouldn't be surprised that we're going to run up with some contradictions, this and that. Anyway, okay, so there's basically four major interesting approaches to the subject of how to relate the scientific origin story and Genesis, and I'll go through each of them. So the first I want to discuss is often called theistic evolution, and this is where you take the scientific origin story more or less at face value and reinterpret Genesis to fit it. This is the approach taken by many, if not most, educated Christians in the modern day, including our own Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I. So he's very open about the fact our spiritual leader says that that the scientific origin story is more or less true, and Genesis is just a sort of theological account of it. They interpret Genesis as being a metaphorical story about God's purposes and intentions for creation and man's relationship to him, but not a literal recording of events as they took place. Therefore, they would say Genesis does record truths about the world, specifically about the nature of God and man, but not scientific truths in terms of how things happened in the past. Theistic evolutionists often lean into the points of harmony between Genesis and the scientific origin story. So like we said, both Genesis and the scientific origin story seem to have this process of unfolding of creation in a linear way, with man as the big kahuna or top dog or whatever. Again, atheists would dispute that, as Tom rightly said, but that's where they sort of lean into these points of harmony. Theistic evolutionists often say that death existed, at least in the animal world, for billions of years before Adam's sin. So they would accept that God created the natural world and just let it play out, and it's okay that all these animals suffered and died. It was part of God's creation of man. And they say that the flood of Noah was what we'd call a local catastrophe. Now, when I say local, I don't mean it was necessarily small. It would have been humongous, but they would say maybe it just engulfed the Near East or whatever, and then the rest of the world untouched. So they say maybe a flood happened, but it was limited in scope, perhaps just in the area around Ararat and Turkey, Iraq, and so forth. Some theistic evolutionists interpret Adam and Eve as being literal people who descended from an ape-like common ancestor. Some think that Adam and Eve were specially created, but they were put into a population of ape-like common ancestors and then allowed to mix with each other. And some just interpret Adam and Eve as metaphors for the human condition. Likewise, they have a novel interpretation of the fall. So they can say maybe that the fall worked backwards in time, or they can say that the fall, and I think this is the Catholic position, as people were telling me, the fall was just the first, monkeys turned humans becoming self-aware. That's what the fall was. When they looked around and they saw evil, that was the fall. From the traditional Orthodox perspective, that's weak and limited. Maybe I'm misrepresenting the Catholic. Maybe that's not Catholic. I don't know, but that is what I've heard some people say. So what about this approach, theistic evolution? It has the obvious advantage of being fully reconcilable with modern science. No one is going to laugh you out of a science classroom for saying all that. And it's also reconcilable with any future developments in mainstream science. If you're always willing to, yield to the scientific evidence in terms of your interpretation of Genesis, then you can always, find a way to fit sort of whatever the mainstream is saying. It has the obvious disadvantage that it deviates from how the church and church fathers have always interpreted history. So some people in the modern day do try to tie themselves in knots to say that people didn't interpret Genesis the way young Earth creationists do, but it really does seem before the 1850s the vast majority of Christians interpreted Genesis as literal.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta have a certain empathy for the fathers. I know Luther wasn't a father, but he was an important voice in the Protestant Reformation in particular. And he once made a comment, well, of course, the sun revolves around the earth and not the earth around the sun, because after all, who's the Old Testament guy? The Gideon.
Joshua. Or was it Gideon?
I thought it was Gideon made the sun stand still. Now that couldn't be true if the
Earth revolves around
the sun. So obviously the sun revolves around the earth, and that's scientific and biblical fact. Well, nobody, you couldn't find anyone in my seminary that would have ever.
Right. It's a geocentrism. Right. So,
So
some people would say, that the fathers believe what they believe because the information available to them was insufficient.
Right.
Compared to what we have now.
Exactly.
So that is a position you can take. That is something people, even Orthodox Christians, say. But the disadvantage is that it deviates from how the church and church fathers have always interpreted history, and even how Jesus himself seems to have talked about things. So like we said, Jesus, at very least, does seem to have talked about the flood as something that literally happened in the past. And if a worldwide flood happened in the past, that would change your view of Earth history radically from what's mainstream now. Additionally, this position, theistic evolution, has the added perplexity that Darwin's theory was almost specifically formulated to remove the hand of God from the origin and diversification of life. So you will have specific figures in the history of biology who are explicitly saying we are trying to get God out of the picture. I mean, as recently I remember there's this famous quote people toss around from a biologist named Lewontin was the last name, I can't remember the first name, who said, we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, very famously. We can't even let God give God a little bit of ground. So if to be a theistic evolutionist, you're in harmony with modern science, but you're also in harmony with scientists who are actually trying to actively exclude God, which is kind of a peculiar situation to be in. Nevertheless, theistic evolution is a viable outlook for Orthodox Christian, and perhaps it's the most popular. I don't know. I don't know that there are any surveys of this. In all honesty, I think most people haven't thought too hard about it, and is what it comes down to. So people will just say whatever if you surveyed them on the street is my expectation. But this is a viable outlook. Theistic evolution is an option you can take. Lean in on the science and sort of have Genesis reinterpreted to fit whatever the science is. Okay, the second approach I want to discuss is goes by many names, and it's a bit more of a broad category, but it's sometimes called Old Earth creationism. This is the view that was mostly, especially promulgated by the intelligent design movement, which rose to prominence in the 90s and early 2000s. They run a famous institute called the Discovery Institute. They're still around. They write books. Some are good. So old Earth creationists and intelligent design proponents accept the conclusions of geology and cosmology, which say that the universe and the Earth are very old, but they reject a Darwinian view of evolution. They usually accept that animal life evolved from a universal common ancestor, albeit only with intervention by God to propel and guide the evolutionary process. They sometimes consider humans specially created, like all the other animals evolved, but just humans were created by God, or sometimes they say humans evolved too, but again, only with God's intervention. So they would say, yes, some kind of process of unfolding happened in the past, but it couldn't have happened on its own. Darwinism, natural selection acting on random variation, they would say, is not sufficient to explain these big changes. So they make a distinction between what's called microevolution and macroevolution. Old Earth creationists say that animal death and natural evil existed before the fall, and they said that Noah's flood was local, confined to one region of the Earth rather than global. The primary motivation for Old Earth creationism / ID, intelligent design, seems to be to accept mainstream science while rejecting Darwin. So they accept everything about mainstream science except for Darwin, because Darwin tried to remove God from the picture entirely, saying life could develop on its own without any intervention. For my own perspective, I'm trying not to editorialize until the end. From my own perspective, this does strike me as the worst of both worlds, because you're really not making the scientists or the Bible happy. You're kind of compromising in both directions. On the one hand, it falls far short of supporting a traditional biblical worldview by rejecting the fall and the flood, and on the other hand, it also doesn't find a home in mainstream science, which would generally say that the Darwinian picture is the most accurate. Nevertheless, this view has had a number of strong defenders in the past and in the present day. So some people, including PhD scientists who are believers, say this is the best interpretation of the facts available. So for me, it appeals the least out of everything we're talking about, but it is an approach. The third approach we can talk about is often called young Earth creationism. But it is in reality, young Earth creation is in reality, for the most part, just a traditional view held by most Christians before the 1800s. Again, some people try to spin like it was this new thing invented by Protestant fundamentalists. It really wasn't. Most people just took the 6 days of most people before the 1800s took the 6 days to be literal, took the chronology in Genesis, that leads us to 6,000 years is roughly accurate. Young Earth creationists hold to a relatively literal reading of Genesis, with animals and human beings be specially created by God at some point in the last 10,000 years ago. Young Earth creationists accept that natural selection adaptation account for some of the biodiversity we see in the modern world, but only within limits. So, most Young Earth creationists would say that, yeah, probably one common ancestor led to foxes and dogs and wolves, but it didn't lead to cats. They would say that would be a different common ancestor. Yes.
Speciation.
Yeah, so speciation of so most young Earth creationists would say speciation happened, but primarily within like families or genuses, with the plural of which is genre, within genre, but not you wouldn't have they wouldn't have dinosaurs becoming birds. They would just have birds becoming different types of birds, for example. So young Earth creationists tend to distinguish between macro and micro evolution. Young Earth creationists believe that there was no human or animal death before the first human beings fell into sin, and that there was a worldwide flood in the days of Noah. So young Earth creationists believe that most or all of the geologic column or fossil record was produced by the flood, and therefore not evidence of long ages and evolution. So they see this pattern in the rock layers, and in saying, instead of being laid down over millions of years, this was all just 1 year. That's why you have the sea creatures at the bottom. They were the first things to be buried by the flood, and then more shallow animals and coastal animals. That's why you have like kind of the transition to sea and land, and then you have land animals and stuff, and then birds, up towards the top because they were flying away until they couldn't anymore. So they do have a reinterpretation of this. But like I said, you have two big things. If this is going to be a review, you have two big things to contend with. One is the radiometric dates, I've said. The radiometric dates do make it seem like you have a long period of time passing. Number two is, why are there no humans down here? If the flood was meant to wipe out humans, why are they only like right up here at the top? And there's no easy answer for that, I think, in young Earth creationism. Doesn't mean it's a view you can't hold. It just means that you have to come up with some explanation for that. So young Earth creationism has the advantage of being fully consistent with the traditional Orthodox understanding of creationism. So that is a big plus, obviously. Likewise, almost every Orthodox saint who commented on evolution, so any Orthodox saint who lived since the time of the 1850s who had something to say about evolution, they were pretty much always negative. They had nothing nice to say about Darwin or man, specifically human beings coming from apes. So almost most of the Orthodox saints who lived from that time, not categorically all of them per se, but most of them express some form of what we'd call young Earth creationism. Nevertheless, young Earth creationism has the significant disadvantage of being almost universally denounced by the scientific establishment and scientists. So you will get laughed out of your geology classroom or whatever, at least in a mainstream university, if you express these views, or your biology classroom or whatever other classroom you're in. So basically, you have you can lean in hard on the science and reinterpret Genesis. You can try to find the middle, which I don't think works, but some people do it. Or you can lean in really hard on Genesis and try to readjust the science. These are your three main options. Now, there's one final dark horse candidate, which is very interesting to me. That seems to exist only within Orthodoxy, and even within Orthodoxy is small and fringe, to the point I don't think anyone's ever heard of it but me. But I have heard of it, so you're going to learn about it. It's the idea called altarism. Altarism. Yeah, that's a word. Alterism. And the altarist view leans heavily on the ancient interpretation of Genesis 3:21 that I talked about way towards the beginning of the class, which is that when God gave Adam and Eve coats of skin, that was actually referring to them becoming material after the fall. So whereas before they were more incorporeal. So the view, and by the way, this is really substantially in the church fathers and the elders of the church. This is not a new idea, which is one of the reasons altarism is attractive for me. The view that creation before the fall was more material is actually supported by many church fathers and more recent saints. So you can find references of sayings like Saint Simeon the New Theologian. I said that before the fall, even the stars were like immaterial. They weren't the physical balls of gas we know now, but they were of some different nature. And all plants and animals were of a different nature. So we're not just inventing this new idea to try to reconcile things with modern science. This does seem to be in the ancient fathers. Yes?
Could it be something like I don't know if we consider heaven to be physical or spiritual or both?
Both.
So maybe it would be like a perverted heaven coming out of heavenly state to like a physical state.
Right. Well, that's exactly what I'm getting at, is kind of this idea that so according to the altarist view, the original creation was created specially in 6 days by God, and death did not exist before human beings fell. Rather, the original creation preceded the material universe. So the world God created in 6 days was created in 6 days, and it was before the Big Bang. And what we know as the Big Bang and evolution were just the process of that original creation becoming material. So this whole process of material is the means by which human beings, which were created in the beginning, were getting their bodies. So what we know is the Big Bang and evolution did happen, and creation did happen, but the Big Bang and evolution were just the process of the materialization of the cosmos. This is a really novel interpretation that quite intrigues me, because it seems to reconcile a literal fall with modern science. It also relies to a significant degree on traditional patristic teaching regarding the immateriality of creation, so without introducing something alien. So it's not that we're creating this new idea to try to make our ideas fit, but we're going back to the fathers and finding that the fathers have something that kind of helps our ideas line up. But it still doesn't have a literal flood. Or at least if there is a literal flood, it's a local flood. It's some localized to some part of the ancient Near East, but it's not the whole geologic column. So it seems to reconcile a lot of things. It doesn't quite get the flood. If you want to get the flood in there, you really, I think, have to take the young Earth creationist view. And it does require some odd thoughts. So the evolution of the first humans was not their actual origin, but merely becoming physical. How does that work? It really does look like origin. But what about the Old Testament histories, which seem to, Abel seems to come out of Cain and Abel seem to come out of a literal Garden of Eden and literal paradise. How does that line up with the rest of the history of the world? So altruism doesn't solve all your problems. I think it solves many of them, and it's like very intriguing. And I like that it's uniquely Orthodox. This is not something you'll hear among the Catholics or the Protestants because they don't remember so much about the immateriality thing. But that is a very ancient interpretation of Genesis. I would like to see this view fleshed out more. I find it very interesting, and I feel like it could go a long way to at least providing important material for our reflections on this subject. However, it is a fringe view. Like, so even within Orthodoxy, you bring that up and most people are going to say, what? The biggest reason I brought it up was because it was promoted by Jordan. Wouldn't this also fit well with theosis? Yes, with our belief that human beings can become divine. The belief that human beings were originally immaterial fits quite well with the idea that we're kind of destined for sort of immateriality, just like the saints are. Absolutely. And this view was promoted by a bishop named Bishop Basil Radzianko, who was, by all accounts, he died in the 90s, so he was very recent. By all accounts, he was a very holy and spiritual man, and he was the one who kind of developed this idea of altruism, and he wrote a book on it, which is sitting on my shelf, which I haven't read. It hasn't been translated into English yet, but I plan to read it at some point. But if this view, which is so fringe, weren't endorsed by like someone so holy with that kind of pedigree, I probably wouldn't bring it up. But the fact that it was means that maybe it has some, because the true facts about the world, at least according to the Orthodox view, don't just come from the people who've worked them out with their minds, but they come from people who've had contact with God. And so Bishop Basil may well have been one of those people. I've met, two people who are disciples of his who said he was, pretty much a saint. Yes. I've heard of others who like Orthodox intellectuals from this last century. There's an essay on the subject I can link you to that kind of brings it together. Not many.
I think Sarah mentions the immateriality
yes.
of the fall, but I don't know where.
He got it from the fathers. And so you can also be a young Earth creationist and believe in the immateriality of the fall. So if you believe that this was all made by the flood, then whatever happened before the flood has just disappeared from history. So you can still believe whatever you want about whatever happened before the flood, that it was all immaterial or whatever, because, it was just wiped out by the flood itself. So both the young Earth creationists and the alterists can kind of have this view of the immateriality, but that's kind of not as available to the other groups. So anyway, and what I like about altruism too is it does seem to be quite creative. It does seem to be an idea that other people hadn't really thought of before. And that it increases. So anyway, so there are these four positions. We have this difficulty between Genesis and the scientific origin story. You can be a theistic evolutionist and lean into the science. You can be an old Earth creationist and kind of try to cut a middle way. You can be a young Earth creationist and just go all traditional all the way, or you can become an alterist, which is like sort of a weird fourth thing. But which is very interesting. There are nuances in all of these approaches. And if you ask 10 different scholars, you may get 10 different opinions. I'm just trying to characterize in broad strokes the major outlooks among Christians and Orthodox Christians regarding creation and evolution. I'm just trying to give you material to think about. We're approaching 2 hours, so I'm going to wrap up, don't worry. I just want to teach you what the actual challenges are and then give you some tools necessary to navigate the issue with nuance, so that you in your own life and your spiritual life can really think about these things in a way that's intelligent, because so many people think about these things in ways that they're stupid. My own view. What is my own view? I've done a 180 on this in the last few years. So I used to be very solidly a theistic evolutionist. I really just thought, the science is just the science and we're just gonna have to work around that. And, because that's how I was brought up, and it made sense. My mind changed rather significantly when I or at least began to change a few years ago when I read this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was, and this was a big deal of a book back in the 60s or 70s whenever it was published. But this was by a historian and philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn. And he basically goes into the history of science and analyzes, okay, the way it actually works and develops. And his big idea was the idea of the paradigm shift. So his idea was that all scientists work within one sort of worldview called a paradigm, and that science advances within the paradigm, but that a scientific revolution is when something comes up that totally upheaves the paradigm and shifts the way scientific thinking is done. And when that happens, you actually end up throwing out a lot of the old science and adopting a whole new way of looking at the world. And using that as a base, I at least for myself, began to see a way in which perhaps the science, science sees things the way it does, not because of pure objectivity, but because of the paradigm which modern mainstream science has. Maybe because the framework within scientists are working has guided them to these conclusions, and it's not a matter of like pure objectivity. So that was the beginning of the crack. Also, you know, during these last several years, seeing scientists, you know, as a group, just endorse things that are, I mean, forgive me, but like obvious falsehoods. I'm not even talking about COVID because I don't know enough about COVID to comment on that, and so I don't know about that or vaccines, and I don't try to comment because I just don't know. But the one thing I've seen is, you know, specifically, I know this is like very controversial, and this is going to go on YouTube, but whatever. You know, the transgender phenomenon. I mean, you can have you know, people look you in the eye and then tell you that a man is a woman or a woman is a man. I mean, and it's not like this stupid, you know, podunk trailer park hillbillies were saying that. This is like the America's best and brightest. Like you can go on campus at Harvard and MIT, and some of the smartest people in the United States will tell you things that are blatantly false, and then justify it with like very shaky scientific reasoning or something like that. So it kind of like just and seeing like the you know, the takeover of ideas like transgender over all of, you know, America's intellectual centers made me think, okay, if they're blatantly nakedly wrong about that, maybe they can be blatantly nakedly wrong about other things too. So these kind of coming together things. I also read this book, Science Set Free, by Rupert Sheldrake. That's fantastic and so much fun. I won't ruin it for you. Just read it if you want. It's very good. So reading the structure of scientific revolutions and watching scientists say stupid things in public kind of shifted my view of science. Yes, I still have a very high view of science, and I still have a huge amount of respect for scientists, but I no longer see it as infallible as I once did. Second, I became aware of the small number of young Earth creationists who are actually doing good science. Scientists with PhDs doing good scientists. Most young Earth creationists are propagandists, and they're full of baloney, and they say stupid things, and like, you know, just like, I didn't evolve from no monkey, my Bible tells me so. But like some of them are actually like really intelligent and sophisticated, and they have PhDs in relevant fields. I fell in love with this one scholar named Kurt Wise, who is a paleontologist with a PhD in paleontology from Harvard. Okay, so very, very mainstream of mainstream institutions, who just like his whole career is trying to interpret the fossil record in a way that supports the flood and not the evolutionary. There aren't many of these people, and they're definitely very much a fringe minority, but they're there and they're intelligent and they make good arguments. So that helped me. But the biggest thing that changed my views was becoming more convinced of the reality of the supernatural. You know, being exposed to miracles, both in my own life, like things that were like unambiguously supernatural, you know, and becoming more aware from people I know within my circles of, you know, everything, you know, from icons that cry to miraculous healings to, you know, elders that know your name before you've ever met them or stuff. I just became convinced that this is all very real. Both in not just secondhand, in my own life as well. And from that point of view, like it just makes me think that the reality that the world is much more mysterious than, you know, anyone who tries to like condense it down to something small. So you know, there's this one Romanian monk I was watching on YouTube who was talking about, you know, he's talking about why he doesn't believe in Darwinian evolution, and the whole reason he doesn't believe in I mean, actually he has a whole long thing about it, but he's like, you know, at one point when he was at the burial of someone, as they were saying, they were talking about what they were going to do at the post-funeral meal. The dead body got up and said, "Well, please make some sarmale for me," which is very Romanian. So yeah, if you see a dead guy get up, I'd say you would be like, in a sort of roundabout way, kind of justified in questioning the scientific origin story. I just like that perspective, you know, affected me. So if you put a gun to my head and made me choose, I would say I'm probably a young Earth creationist. I think that the world is probably less than 10,000 years old, probably specially created by God. I believe that there was a literal flood in Noah's day. But I'm also interested in altruism. I like to be scientifically literate, and I like to have an open mind about a lot of things. Like I tried to emphasize, like there's real scientific data that drives a lot of the scientific beliefs. It's not just like made up to like destroy Christianity. So we have to deal with it in some way. We can't just say, oh, it's all bull crap, I reject it. But I also wouldn't lean into it all the way either. You know, science is not infallible. So I keep an open mind, but that's my perspective. The key thing is that I'm convinced of the reality of God for reasons independent of Earth history. It wasn't that I, read about evolution or whatever, and that's what convinced me or didn't convince me of the existence of God. I came to believe in God through reasons related to personal experience, related to people around me, related to philosophical and other stuff, and that also affected my interpretation of Earth history. So that's that. The end. Okay, it's been almost 2 hours, so I'm gonna just end the recording right now. God bless you. Christ our God, you are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You have completed the divine plan, plan of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness now and ever into the ages of ages. Amen. Good night. I'm gonna hang around and we can still talk and everything, but the recording's ending. Okay.